Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started right now. It's nice to see all of you here today. Thank you for coming to today's event. My name is Chi Chiu, Head of Scholarly Services at the Asian Division. On behalf of the Asian Division and the Geography and Map Division, I would like to welcome everyone to today's program. But before we hear from Mr. Harold Meinheit about the mapping of Siam in the late 19th century, please allow me to take a few minutes to talk briefly about the Asian collections at the Library of Congress. The library started to collect Asian collections as early as the late 19th century. And our earliest items are indeed from Southeast Asia. Believe it or not, are items collected by Lieutenant Charles Wilkes from his exploring expedition to the Southern Sea in the 19th century. And today, our collections have grown to represent one of the most comprehensive collections of Asian studies in the world, containing more than 4 million physical items and numerous digital resources. And these items are in over 190 Asian languages, including almost all subject fields and covering an area ranging from Southeast subcontinent to Southeast Asia to East Asia. And the Asian Reading Room is also located here in the Jefferson Building on the first floor at the other side of the building. It is home to a big multi-language reference collections of various Asian languages, and it is where users can access both physical and digital resources in Asian languages. Our libraries are open from Monday to Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Any users above 16 years old can come get a reader registration card and come to use the library reading rooms, including Asian Reading Room. And at the Asian Reading Room, besides requesting Asian language materials, you can also get reference assistance from our subject specialists. More information about our collections and services could be found on the website of our collection. The website is located on the cover of the brochure placed outside. Please feel free to grab one as you step out after the program. Also, if you are interested to take a tour of the Asian Reading Room after the program, I'm sure our Southeast Asian librarian, Joshua Quake, will be happy to give you a tour to take you there. But do not worry if you do not have time today after the program. We are looking forward to seeing you in the reading room some other time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Quake to introduce our speaker and our program for today.
Thank you, Dr. Chu-Chi. Welcome everyone once again today to our event, Boundaries and Brigands. I want to thank you for taking time out to attend our event. I know it's been a rainy day out there, so I'm glad to see a good turnout. My name is Joshua Quake, and I'm the reference librarian for Southeast Asia at the Asian Division of the Library of Congress. Southeast Asia, as conceived by most people at present, is made up of 11 countries: Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, the Philippines, and Timor-Leste. I hope I didn't miss any. Given the sheer number of countries in Southeast Asia, the conversation of the region tends to be fragmented into scholarship that is usually national in focus. So it's rather uncommon to find people working on topics that are more expansive in scope. Perhaps because attempting such an approach is a daunting task with multiple languages and historiographies with which to grapple. Fortunately for us today, we have with us such a scholar who is willing and able to take on the challenge of examining a topic that crosses boundaries. The person I speak of is, of course, our speaker, Mr. Harold Meinheit. Harold Meinheit is a former Foreign Service officer of the U.S. State Department. He has a deep knowledge of Southeast Asia, having worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand from 1965 to 1967, and then serving in the Foreign Service in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Mr. Meinheit lists among his languages Vietnamese, Malay, and Thai. He has authored various articles concerning cartography in Southeast Asia, the most recent of which was The Man Who Mapped Siam, James McCarthy and the Royal Survey Department. It was from the mentioned article that I learned about Mr. Meinheit's work. In this article, Mr. Meinheit brings to the fore the centrality of mapping the margins in consolidating the Kingdom of Siam. By bringing attention to the 19th century competition to map territories in mainland Southeast Asia, Mr. Meinheit causes one to think about both the global and the local. He reminds us of the roles of science and colonialism, both of which were global forces and narratives, in shaping realities on the ground. Furthermore, he reminds us how Southeast Asian peoples were very much active participants in these global negotiations by adopting new technologies, pushing back against colonial pressures, and maneuvering in the shrinking spaces between empires. Well, our time today is short, and so I won't say too much more. I'm sure we are all excited to hear what our speaker has to say. But before I invite Mr. Meinheit to speak to us, let me just quickly ask that you please hold your questions until the Q&A portion of today's lecture. Also, please note that we are recording this lecture for a webcast. So by asking questions, you are implicitly giving the Library of Congress permission to record you and your questions. Lastly, if you could please switch your phones to silent mode to avoid interruptions, that would be appreciated. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Harold Meinheit to the stage.
Thank you, Joshua, for that kind introduction. And it's an honor to be here at the Library of Congress. I want to thank both the Asian Division and the Geography and Map Division for sponsoring this program. And I appreciate all of you coming here to attend and to listen to the topic, which is somewhat obscure, but I know there's some people with background in Thailand here, such as Ambassador Brown, our former ambassador to Bangkok, who have some background in the country, and look forward to your questions at the end. Today, I hope to cover the following outline in the course of the next 30 minutes or so. This largely traces James McCarthy's surveys and mapping of the Kingdom of Siam during the 1880s and the 1890s, a period of intense colonial pressure and internal reform in Siam. By the late 1890s, my focus shifts somewhat to the work of McCarthy's Royal Survey Department. James McCarthy first came to my attention many years ago when I discovered his book, Surveying and Exploring in Siam, while researching a seminar paper on the 1893 French takeover of Laos. I was immediately fascinated by his account, not only of his survey work, but also by his vivid descriptions of Siam and the Lao principalities. More recently, I returned to his book as the basis for an article published in last fall's Portland, the Journal of the Washington Map Society. This is McCarthy's book. It's been translated into Thai. I believe over on one of the tables here is the Thai translation, which is in the Asian division. And there's also a modern edition, reprint that was done by White Lotus Press in Bangkok. So it's still available if you're interested in getting a copy. Aside from writing a good book, Why is McCarthy's work of broader interest? In sum, James McCarthy was the key figure in bringing Western scientific mapping to Siam during the last 2 decades of the 19th century. A professional surveyor, McCarthy produced what are generally considered to be the first accurate Western maps of the kingdom. His maps also became reference documents for the diplomatic struggles of the day. Over the long run, however, McCarthy's greater achievement was his leadership in establishing the Royal Survey Department, an institution that reinforced Siam's administrative reforms and the centralization of the state. By the middle of the 19th century, Siam was facing a new geopolitical challenge. Its traditional rivals, Burma and Vietnam, had been replaced by the expanding colonial powers of Britain and France. Siam's continued survival would require effective leadership, adroit diplomacy, internal reforms, and flexibility to deal with this increased pressure. Into this mix should be added cartography and the introduction of Western mapping techniques. At mid-century, European maps reflected limited knowledge of Siam and only a vague sense of the extent of the kingdom. This is a map by John Arrowsmith that's fairly representative of how the kingdom was portrayed during much of the first half of the 19th century. You see considerable detail in Burma, where the British were advancing, and Vietnam's coast and provincial boundaries are portrayed. But there's only limited detail on Siam, with large unknown areas and with boundaries only vaguely sketched based on the accounts of Western visitors and diplomats. By the end of the century, however, the publication of this map by McCarthy offered what is essentially a modern portrayal of the kingdom. This is a map in 2 sheets, but I'll come back to it later. James McCarthy came to Siam as a member of the British surveying team in 1879. The team was charged with extending the survey of India from British Burma to Bangkok, using the mapping technique of triangulation. This involved carefully measuring a baseline and then measuring the angles at each end of the line to a distant point. The lengths of the other sides of the triangle could then be calculated, and these sides could then be used as new baselines to extend the process. McCarthy carried the triangulation on to Bangkok and to the Gulf of Siam. One of his important survey stations was the highest point in Bangkok, a Buddhist stupa called Phu Khao Thong, the Golden Mountain. This is a detail of his triangulation chart that shows the starting point at Phu Khao Thong. And this is Phu Khao Thong, and it's it's indicated clearly on his 1900 map as well, showing how important it was as a triangulation station. Bangkok, of course, for many of you who've been there, it's very, very flat, so it's difficult for surveyors and you need high points. But it would have been probably a little unusual for a Thai to look up at Phu Khao Thong and see theodolites and surveyors working on the top of this spire. While McCarthy was in Bangkok, the British Vice Consul asked him to help a Siamese expedition survey the route for a telegraph line from Bangkok to Burma. McCarthy's work impressed his Siamese counterparts, who offered him a job, and McCarthy resigned from the Survey of India in 1881 to go to work for the government of Siam. Despite McCarthy's initial enthusiasm, he was to find strong resistance in Siam to Western mapping. Why then was Western mapping suddenly accepted and a British surveyor employed to map the kingdom? The decisive factor was King Chulalongkorn, Rama V. Chulalongkorn had come to recognize the importance of Western cartography during earlier visits to the Malay Peninsula, the East Indies, and India in the 1870s. Throughout McCarthy's service in Siam, he was to receive strong backing from the king and the king's half-brother, Prince Damrong. Sometimes a cartoon says it all, and this one does say something. One of the defining characteristics of the modern state is clearly delineated boundaries, nice, neat lines on the map. At the time that McCarthy began mapping Siam, however, the kingdom was extensive, but without clearly defined boundaries. The historian O.W. Walters used the concept of the mandala, borrowed from Indian cosmography, to describe the early model of Southeast Asian kingdoms. Under the mandala, the power of the kingdom spread out from its center, gradually diminishing as the geographic distance increased. At the outer edge of the kingdom's mandala, smaller centers could look in different directions and establish tributary relationships to ensure their security. Needless to say, this system clashed with European concepts. Early in the 19th century, the Siamese were puzzled by the European emphasis on precisely demarcated borders. After the First Anglo-Burma War, the British approached Siam, requesting cooperation in demarcating the border. Siam, however, saw no need to do so and told the British, just talk to the villagers in the area, just talk to the villagers. They would know where the boundary should be. The 1826 treaty between Siam and Great Britain simply states that if there's any doubt about the boundary, British border officials should just contact the nearest Siamese village chief to settle the issue in a friendly manner. By the 1870s, under King Chulalongkorn's direction, this attitude was starting to change. Asking the villagers was not on the agenda when the king sent McCarthy to Siam's far south, to the Malay Peninsula, where Bangkok exercised suzerainty over several Malay principalities. This is just a modern map showing the general area of Patani where McCarthy went on one of his major survey missions. The British were pressing a claim by the Malay state of Perak over land in the district of Raman, part of the Siamese province of Patani. McCarthy carried out the survey in difficult jungle terrain and produced a map that showed Perak was claiming about 2,000 square miles of Raman. This is not the map that he finally produced, which is a very large-scale map. I was not able to find that map, and it may not exist any longer, but these are a couple of the sketch matches at the Royal Geographical Society in London that McCarthy had used during that survey. McCarthy's map then played a role in strengthening Siam's diplomatic position against both British and French pressure. Siam's foreign minister brought McCarthy's map to Britain's senior diplomat in Bangkok, Ernest Satow, who agreed to send it to London in support of Siam's claim against Perak. Satow's motivation was in part to prevent the French from challenging Siam's boundary claims in Cambodia. He wrote to the Foreign Office, "As I understand, HMG would prefer to see Siam remain independent. It seems to me that there is nothing to be gained by supporting the Raja of Perak." The British backed off and did not press the claim, at least at that time. McCarthy was next asked by King Chulalongkorn to lead an expedition to Siam's northeastern frontier. Again, this is just a modern map showing the general area where McCarthy surveyed during his first expedition to the Lao territories. This was an ill-defined territory based on the left bank of the Mekong in what is today Laos. McCarthy welcomed the opportunity, writing, "The frontier region provided a wide and interesting field, for the great part of it still remained unvisited by Europeans, and on the maps the country was a blank." This is a French map of 1881, probably the best map of Southeast Asia, at least of Siam and Indochina at the time. And as you can see, Dereen's has just designated the area in Laos as an unknown region inhabited by Lao tribes, just a huge blank on the map. The region was being victimized by Chinese brigands and armed bands that had fled southern China after failed rebellions. These are some of the fellows that you might meet if you're out wandering in the jungle in those days, probably not especially friendly, but this was a major problem for the Siamese and for the other groups in Laos at the time. These groups were called the Ha by the Siamese, and were often referred to by the colors of their flags, which black flags, yellow flags, red flags, and striped flags. Siam wanted to suppress these groups while also mapping a region that it considered to be part of its dependencies. The blank space that McCarthy sought to survey was indeed a confusing world, without well-defined borders of modern states. It was a world of small Lao and Thai principalities that existed on the margins of the mandalas of the major powers, balancing their existence by paying tribute at times to 2 or 3 of their more powerful neighbors. A frustrated McCarthy often complained about the complications this institution caused for his surveying and map-making. A later Royal Survey Department map even printed a notation warning people that this area, this is the 12 Thai principalities on the Black River, and showing that they owe allegiance in three directions, to Siam, to China, and to Vietnam, Annam. The most important of these Lao territories was the small kingdom of Luang Prabang, but other key regions that were not mapped included Muang Puan, which is in the region of the Plain of Jars, a group of small towns with the unwieldy name of Huapan Tangha Tanghok, which I've shortened to Huapan, and the Sipsong Jutai, the 12 Thai chiefdoms. The Sipsong Jutai was centered at Muang Lai on the Black River and included the important upland valley of Dien Bien Phu. It was in this contested space that what Professor Tongchai calls a mapping crossfire took place between Siam and France in the 1880s and the 1890s. McCarthy's party surveyed and collected intelligence on the Puan region, centered at Chiang Quang on the Plain of Jars. They found the area totally devastated by the Haw. This, McCarthy's first expedition to the Lao region, was ended at the royal city of Luang Prabang by bad weather and disease. Returning to Bangkok, he resumed work on his maps and requested permission from the Siamese government to send his work to the Royal Geographical Society in London. At the end of the rainy season, King Chulalongkorn sent McCarthy back to Luang Prabang, this time to accompany a Siamese military expedition against a Haw base near the Plain of Jars. When the battle became a stalemate, McCarthy convinced one of the Siamese generals to accompany him to the Sipsong Jutai. McCarthy's goal was to reach Muang Lai, which is Lai Chau in Vietnamese these days, the principal settlement located on the Black River. Although unable to reach Muang Lai, McCarthy did explore and map the upland valley of Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu, which is a name I'm sure is familiar to many, which became much more famous in 1954, but at this time, it was an important site because it marked the outer limits of the territory Bangkok claimed as a dependency and was a key link on the route between Luang Prabang and Hanoi. While mapping the valley, McCarthy was also able to collect current intelligence on the dominant political force in the Sipsong Jutai, the powerful Deo clan. For the time being, at least, the clan proclaimed its loyalty to the King of Siam. This is Deo Van Tree seated on the left. He also has a Lao name, Gam Un, and his black flag allies are behind him. He had both, as I say, a Vietnamese and a Lao name, which was fairly typical of a lot of the local leaders in this contested area where people paid allegiance to several different powers at the same time. Leaving Dien Bien Phu for Bangkok, McCarthy's second mission to Laos ended. In Bangkok, however, he soon found he was taking on more formal responsibilities, for in September 1885, a government decree established the Royal Survey Department, which McCarthy was named as superintendent. But the frontier soon beckoned him back, this time to accompany a new Siamese military operation led by General Surasak Mantri against the Haws at Dien Bien Phu. This time, the military and mapping expedition was to be more complicated. For the year was 1886, and it was significant because of the arrival of Auguste Pavie, who was named France's vice consul in Luang Prabang. With Pavie came the real beginning of the mapping crossfire between Siam and France in the Lao principalities. Pavie was to lead an intense mapping enterprise over the next decade that employed some 40 Europeans and 10 Indo-Chinese with the ultimate objective of bringing the region under French control. Pavie arrived in Luang Prabang in the midst of Surasak's campaign in Dien Bien Phu, and while McCarthy was trying to survey the frontier up to the Black River to reinforce Siam's boundary claims. However, before McCarthy could reach the Black River, he fell ill and was forced to return to Bangkok. Although unable to rejoin Surasak, McCarthy's surveyors, led by his deputy, D.J. Collins, remained with the general. Just as McCarthy was leaving, Pavie was starting his own mapping activities from Luang Prabang to Dien Bien Phu. Again, this is Pavie with his colleagues, surveying colleagues, and his route map from Luang Prabang all the way to Muang Lai with Dien Bien Phu near the center. Just as McCarthy was leaving, Pavie was starting this, and General Surasak met him and tried to persuade him to accept Siam's territorial claims in the region. Surasak had his maps, but Pavie rejected them as incomplete. This is Pavie's portrayal of the Siamese claims as presented to him by General Surasak. As you can see, they are quite extensive, and they go even well beyond the Black River, halfway towards the Red River in what's now the northern part of Vietnam. The eventual arrival of French troops forced Surasak to abandon mapping the Black River and to shift his mapping operations to Hua Pan. While the French victory at Dien Bien Phu was playing out, McCarthy was in Bangkok working on his map of the kingdom. He carried the map to the Royal Geographical Society in London in 1887 and spoke before the Society that November. The RGS engraved his map of the Kingdom of Siam and its dependencies and published it in the Society's journal in March 1888. Based on extensive survey work by McCarthy and the young Siamese he had trained, the map represented a scientific breakthrough, and in today's Thailand is considered to be the first modern map of Siam. That McCarthy's map was a great improvement is evident when we recall the blank space on the Doreen's 1881 map. We now see this space on McCarthy's map populated with numerous small and large settlements, or muang. The M, the abbreviation M on this stands for muang, which is basically a power center. It can be small, it can be medium-sized, it can be large, it can even be a country. In the Thai language, it's a somewhat vague term, but anyway, you can see the number of population centers that he's identified on his map, which shows both the Sip Song Ju Thai in the north and Hua Pan Tang Ha Tang Hok farther down. Elevations and locations of several passes are also labeled in the mountainous terrain, and McCarthy's map fixes principal towns also in northeast Siam, Isan, by latitude and longitude, while the Doreen's map just had question marks around these locations. Some boundaries are indicated on McCarthy's map. The limits of Siam are suggested by a light yellow outline. A heavy dashed line marks the boundary of Vietnam, roughly along the Annamite chain to about 18 degrees north, where the dashes become lighter and are labeled boundary not defined. A similar use of heavy to lighter dashed lines marks the border with Burma. Northeast of Luang Prabang, the yellow extends across the Sip Song Ju Thai to the Black River. In Cambodia, McCarthy's map also shows the conflicting boundary lines from both Siamese and French maps. As the most accurate map available at the time, McCarthy's map served as a reference for diplomats, as it did during British-Siamese border discussions in 1889. And in several years later, British diplomatic reporting depended on McCarthy's maps to identify strategic locations of French activity in Muang Puan. McCarthy makes only a brief, mysterious reference to his painful experience with a joint commission surveying the northwestern boundary between Burma and Siam. But it followed by McCarthy being asked to conduct a complete examination of Siam's borders. From December 1890 to June 1893, McCarthy's survey party carried out a major triangulation, starting from a peak in northern Burma, Phnom Penh, already fixed by the Survey of India, to Luang Prabang, Puan, and eventually to the boundary of Vietnam. McCarthy celebrated when the triangulation reached Luang Prabang, noting the Lao Kingdom was now connected to the Survey of India. This map, I've identified some of the key locations in the triangulation with Chiang Mai Phnom Penh on the Burma border, and Muang Sing was the most northerly point on the triangulation. He then proceeded down to Luang Prabang, Chiang Quang on the plain of Jars, that's Muang Puan, and eventually to the Vietnamese border. When McCarthy believed he was approaching the boundary with Vietnam, he resorted to the method that so puzzled the British in 1826. He asked the local villagers to show him the boundary. They did so without any problem. In June 1893, McCarthy was suddenly ordered to cease operations and return to Bangkok. The reason, of course, was the ongoing crisis with France, which ended with Siam being forced to cede the left bank of the Mekong to France. After the Franco-Siamese crisis of 1893, McCarthy spent less time in the field and seemed to focus more on the Rural Survey Department, which he had headed since its establishment in 1885. Besides topographical surveys and triangulations, the RSD had added cadastral mapping to its priorities in the late 1890s. But the department's primary achievement was the completion in 1896 of its map of Siam in both large and small scale. The Survey of India offices in Calcutta published the RSD's large-scale map in English. It consisted of 12 sheets, the map of Siam showing Siam's new boundaries following its loss of the left bank of the Mekong. On the right bank, it marks the 25-kilometer demilitarized zone demanded by France. Here you see it with the red dotted line on the right bank of the Mekong. Nong Khai is at the center right of the map, and Vientiane is on the other side of the Mekong, right in the center. And examples of this map are on display here from the Geography and Map Division. This large-scale map is significant and may be seen as a statement of both Siam's scientific achievement and its movement towards becoming a strong, centralized state. In the first place, the title, Map of Siam, suggests a more tightly integrated state that no longer includes the ambiguous dependencies. Secondly, you see in the text block that neither McCarthy nor any other foreigners are mentioned. The map is presented as purely a Siamese accomplishment. And finally, 2 Siamese government ministers are named as directing the surveys. Prince Damrong was Minister of Interior and was the architect of Siam's provincial administration reform that began in 1893. Central to Damrong's reform was the Monton system to streamline territorial administration throughout the country. The map clearly shows these new territorial divisions. This is the Monton of Krung Thep, which is Bangkok region, and the 2 surrounding Montons on either side. As the former diplomat and scholar Te Bunag has argued, the reform and centralization of Siam's provincial administration was an important factor that helped Siam maintain its independence. The Royal Survey Department supported this process of territorial reform as it increasingly turned to cadastral surveys and triangulation to accurately map the boundaries of these new montons. The other minister named on the map is Field Marshal Surasit Mantri, the veteran of the Laos campaigns, and who is now the Minister of Agriculture. Surasat's ministry now had responsibility for the Royal Thai Survey Department, and the RSD's cadastral mapping was important to his ministry as it measured land use for rice cultivation. It helped with issuing land titles and in tax administration. This is an example of one of the cadastral survey sheets. Again, the Geography and Map Division has got, I'd say, hundreds of these, and no one has ever studied them. So if anybody's interested, there's a good topic for a dissertation. The last map that McCarthy made also reflects the major changes in Damrong's administrative reforms. In 1898, McCarthy submitted a manuscript of his book, Surveying and Exploring in Siam, to the Royal Geographical Society in London. The Society published it along with McCarthy's new map. This map is printed in 2 sheets at 1 to 2 million. This is the second sheet that shows the Malay states and the bordering Siamese claims on the Malay Peninsula. There are also inset maps here of Bangkok, Chiang Mai, and Luang Prabang. The boundaries of the kingdom are outlined in yellow on this map, and in contrast to McCarthy's 1888 map that shows no internal provincial boundaries, this map outlines the new Mountain system that Prince Damrong initiated. This is, again, an example of several of the Mountains. The map represented the culmination of McCarthy's work in Siam and was by far the best map available to the general public at the turn of the century. In awarding McCarthy the Patron's Medal, the president of the Royal Geographical Society called the map the first scientific map of Siam. After retiring from service in Siam in 1901, McCarthy spent the rest of his life in the UK, passing away in 1919 at the age of 66. The international boundaries on McCarthy's 1900 map would remain current for about a decade. However, Siam's borders would be adjusted again when a 1907 treaty with France resulted in the loss of Siam's Cambodian provinces. And finally, a 1909 treaty with Britain resulted in Siam abandoning its claims to the Malay states of Kedah, Perlis, Kelantan, and Terengganu. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the map of Siam's boundaries was essentially what it is today. During the process of state formation, Siam underwent a fundamental shift in the way it viewed itself as a nation. Western mapping was part of the process that moved it from the Mandala concept of space with its vague boundaries to the Western concept of a nation with firm, demarcated boundaries fixed by mathematical survey methods. No longer could the kingdom's rulers, as they did in 1826 with Britain, simply tell its colonial neighbors to just ask the villagers where the boundaries were. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. So we have time for questions now. Let's see. Yes.
Curious as to whatever happened to the Haw. Were they ever subdued, and by whom?
Well, that's a good question. They just sort of disappear from the historical record. First of all, they were faced with overwhelming force when the French started moving in. And they seem to have just gradually faded away. Based on some of the experiences I had in northern Thailand, seeing some of the Chinese irregulars who came down into Burma and northern Siam after the revolution in China, a lot of them just sort of faded into the villages. They intermarry with local population. They had good relationships, the Haw, I think, with some of the upland people, the Hmong and some of the other tribal groups who were up in the higher hills. So my guess is they sort of faded away. Their organization faded away a bit. They probably intermarried. Some of them went back to China, possibly, but there's no clear record of it. No, I think it was settled by then. The Black River was, the French settled the whole region basically as a French colony, but Lai Chau and the Dale clan were firmly under the French control, and then they're now under Vietnamese control, although it's still a distinct minority group, but their allegiances are to the states that are established. The old system of multiple directions of loyalties does not exist anymore, at least maybe in the minds of some people, but it's pretty much gone.
I would be interested to know whether there's an Irish angle to James McCarthy.
Whether there's, I'm sorry?
An Irish angle.
I think there is. I had a hard time with his biography because he was with the Survey of India, and I found his records with the Survey of India, but it doesn't indicate where he is. The British ambassador, the minister in Bangkok, met him a number of times. He'd come in and report on what he was doing. And the British minister does mention that he's a typical Irishman, and some other rather unflattering descriptions of him, which I think represented a certain attitude towards the Irish at the time. But I have not been able to trace. I found his father's name, I found his marriage in the UK, which came very late. But finding a McCarthy in Ireland in the genealogical records is a little tricky. I think if I had more time, I'd love to track it down, but I couldn't find anything more than that.
So you mentioned by the end of his career in Bangkok, he has 300 staff, and they're Europeans and Indians and Thais. Do you have a sense how he recruited them, or is he poaching friends from the India survey? Are there poor Thai civil servants who are now assigned by Chulalongkorn? Now you go learn surveying? How exactly did that work?
Well, there was a school set up for Siamese surveyors. Damrong, actually, Prince Damrong set it up early on. So there was a regular training process going on, and McCarthy always had Siamese with him when he was on his surveying missions. He was training and working with them. But there was certainly a heavy European leadership of the Royal Survey Department. When McCarthy left, an Australian took over, and I haven't traced the evolution of it, but probably for the next couple of decades into the 20th century, it was still largely European-led. The Indians were recruited from the Survey of India, and there's no question about that. But there was definitely a growing body of Siamese trained in cartography. No hard questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you. So what was the main incentive of Mr. McCarthy to resign and then, work for the Siam government? And then in your view, how much his work actually contribute to the strength of negotiation position of the Kingdom of Siam when they were pressed by those colonial powers, comparing to other cases where there's no mapping techniques in other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. His motivation seems to me, if you look even at the title of his book, Surveying and Exploring in Siam, first of all, I think he had a strong professional sense that he wanted to do something with mapping and surveying. He was trained, and Siam, as he said, represented an open field. I mean, there had not been surveying and mapping done there extensively, so he saw that as an opportunity for a well-trained surveyor to work. And I think the Survey of India was, had already extended all the way to the Burmese border, and this was a new field for him. So I think it was both a sense of adventure, probably, as well as a professional scientific interest in producing good maps. How exactly he interacted with the Siamese, with King Chulalongkorn and Prince Damrong and others in diplomatic negotiations, I think his work contributed certainly to Siam's position. I mentioned the time when the British minister in Bangkok sent his large-scale map to London, and it helped Siam reduce pressure on the border with the Malay states in the south, and also served as a lesson to the French in Cambodia that now is not the time to press. There's also a question about McCarthy's, how involved he was in the military planning and the military operations in the Lao principalities. He was definitely there mapping. I think Professor Tongchai in his book, Siam Map, which is essential reading for anybody interested in this period and what's going on. Professor Tongchai, I think, may give him a little more credit than he deserves in actually sitting down and planning military campaigns, telling the government where they can occupy and place their forces and troops. I don't see that in any of the records I've seen. But then again, I have not read, Surasak has an autobiography. It's 2 volumes in Thai, and my Thai reading is limited to about the 2nd grade level, so I have not had a chance to go through that. But Surasak, I think, probably reports more detail on his actual role in military operations in the Lao states. But how this all played into the overall diplomatic status of Siam's negotiations is open. I think mapping was there. It was a supporting role, but it was not the predominant role. I think politics, power, military force, the reality of 2 colonial powers who wanted a buffer state between them in Siam, I think all of these factors played in probably. Maps were a supporting role, but they were not the predominant role. If that's all, we can probably go look at maps, right?
Well, thank you very much, Harold.
Thank you.
Yes, so that concludes the lecture portion of this event, but as Harold has mentioned, there are maps to look at. Actually, Harold was very kind in collaborating with me and also with my colleague Cynthia Smith at Geography and Maps to select these maps as well. So some of them appear in the lecture actually today. So please feel free to have a look at them. And if you have any questions, I'll be around, Harold will be around, Cynthia will be around. So please have a look at them.